It was a quiet evening when I moved into my new house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with well-kept lawns and neatly trimmed hedges. I was excited for a fresh start, hoping for a calm life in this quiet suburb. Little did I know, things wouldn't stay calm for long. I spent most of the day unpacking, arranging my furniture, and making the place feel like home. By the time I finished, it was already dark outside. I was tired, but there was still one thing left to do. I needed to introduce myself to the neighbors. I figured it would be good to meet at least a few people, just to know who was living nearby. I stepped outside and walked over to the house next door. It looked a bit older compared to the others, with a few cracks in the walls and some paint peeling off. The lights were on, and I could see the silhouette of someone moving around inside. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A few seconds passed before the door opened. A middle-aged man stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed just a little too wide. He had a messy beard, and his clothes looked worn. There was something about him that made me uneasy, but I smiled politely. "Hi, I'm your new neighbor," I said, extending my hand. "I just moved in next door." The man didn't take my hand. Instead, he just stared at me for a moment before finally speaking. "You shouldn't have moved here," he said in a low voice. I blinked, unsure of what to say. Excuse me, ma." He leaned closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "This place, it's not safe. You should leave while you can." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man looked around as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. Then he stepped back and closed the door without another word. I stood there, confused and a little scared. What was that about? I shook my head and walked back to my house, trying to brush off the strange encounter. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the man's words. What did he mean by "it's not safe"? I told myself he was probably just some eccentric guy, maybe a little paranoid. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. The next day, I decided to talk to another neighbor. I saw an elderly woman tending to her garden a few houses down, and I walked over to her. She smiled warmly as I approached. "Hello there, dear," she greeted me. "You must be the new neighbor. Welcome." "Thank you," I said, feeling a bit more at ease. "I actually wanted to ask you something. Do you know the man who lives next door to me?" The woman's smile faltered for a moment, and I noticed a hint of worry in her eyes. "Oh, you mean Mr. Thompson?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, I think that's him. He seemed a bit strange when I spoke to him yesterday." The woman sighed, her hands resting on her gardening tools. "Mr. Thompson has had a rough time," she said. "He lost his wife a few years ago, and since then, he hasn't been quite the same. He keeps to himself mostly, but, well, there have been rumors." "Rumors?" I asked. My curiosity piqued. She glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "People say he's seen things," she whispered. "Strange things. He talks about shadows in the night, noises that no one else hears. Most folks think he's just imagining things, but, well, some say there might be something to it." A chill ran through me again. "What kind of things?" I asked. The woman shook her head. "It's probably nothing, dear. Just an old man's imagination. But if I were you, I'd be careful. There's something off about that house." I thanked her for her time and went back home, feeling more unsettled than ever. I tried to go about my day, but the unease lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said. Shadows in the night, strange noises. I listened carefully, my ears straining for any sound. It was past midnight when I heard it. A faint noise, like a soft tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the wall that separated my house from Mr. Thompson's. I held my breath, listening. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I got out of bed, my feet moving silently across the floor. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out what it was. It almost sounded like scratching, like someone was scratching at the wall from the other side. I pulled away, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Should I go over there and see if Mr. Thompson was okay? I decided to wait, hoping the noise would stop. But it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours, until finally, just before dawn, it stopped. The next morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all, and I felt like I was losing my mind. I needed answers. I decided to go back to Mr. Thompson's house, to confront him and find out what was going on. I knocked on his door, my hand trembling. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the doorbell, but it didn't seem to work. I was about to give up when I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. "Mr. Thompson?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty house. There was no response. The air inside was stale, and the house was dark, the curtains drawn. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The living room was empty, the furniture covered in a thick layer of dust. It didn't look like anyone had been living there for a long time. I moved further into the house, my heart pounding. "Mr. Thompson?" I called again, but there was only silence. I reached the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly open. A faint light was coming from inside, flickering like a candle. I walked towards it, my hands shaking. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with strange symbols, drawn all over the walls in what looked like red paint. Candles were scattered around, their flames flickering, casting eerie shadows. In the center of the room was a large mirror, and in front of it stood Mr. Thompson. He was staring at his reflection, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't understand. When I first moved into my new house, I felt excited. It was a quiet street, and the neighborhood seemed friendly. The lawns were well kept, and the houses looked cozy. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. But I had no idea what was waiting for me. After a long day of unpacking, I decided to take a break and meet my neighbors. I thought it would be good to introduce myself. I started with the house next door. It looked a little different from the others. The paint was faded, and the curtains were always drawn. It seemed like no one paid much attention to it. I walked up to the door and knocked lightly. After a moment, the door creaked open. A man stood there staring at me. He looked old, with gray hair and tired eyes. His face was pale, and he didn't smile. "Hi, I'm your new neighbor," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I just moved in next door." The man looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "You shouldn't have moved here," he said, his voice rough and low. I was confused. "Excuse me?" I asked. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "It's not safe here," he whispered. "You should leave before it's too late." Then, without another word, he shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned. His words sent a chill down my spine. What did he mean by that? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and went back home. Maybe he was just a strange old man. Every neighborhood had someone like that, right? That night, as I got ready for bed, I kept thinking about what he had said. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that he was just trying to scare me for some reason. But as I lay in bed, I felt uneasy. The house was quiet, but something felt wrong. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a noise. It was a faint tapping sound, coming from the wall that separated my house from the neighbors. At first, I thought it might be a branch against the window, but the sound was too steady. It was like someone was tapping or scratching at the wall. I sat up, my heart beginning to pound. The noise continued, slow and deliberate. I got out of bed and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I pulled away, my hands shaking. I had no idea what was going on, but I was too scared to investigate further. I tried to ignore the noise and went back to bed. I lay there, listening as the tapping continued, until it finally stopped just before dawn. I barely got any sleep that night. The next morning, I felt exhausted. I couldn't stop thinking about the strange noise and the neighbor's warning. I decided to talk to another neighbor to see if anyone knew what was going on. I saw an older woman across the street, tending to her garden. She looked friendly, so I walked over to her. She smiled as I approached. "Hello, dear," she greeted me. "You must be the new neighbor. Welcome." "Thank you," I said, trying to smile. "I actually wanted to ask you about the man who lives next door to me. Do you know him?" Her smile faded slightly, and I saw a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Oh, you mean Mr. Thompson?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, he seemed a bit strange when I talked to him." The woman sighed. "Mr. Thompson has had a difficult time," she said. "He lost his wife a few years ago, and since then, he hasn't been the same. He keeps to himself, but there are some odd stories about him." "Stories?" I asked, feeling a chill. She hesitated before speaking. "People say he talks about seeing things at night. Strange figures, shadows. Some say he's just a lonely old man, but others think there might be something wrong with that house." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "What kind of things does he see?" I asked. The woman shook her head. "It's probably just his imagination," she said. "But if I were you, I'd be careful." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. I tried to go about my evening as usual, but I felt uneasy. When it was time for bed, I lay there, listening for any noise. For a while, it was quiet, and I began to think that maybe everything was fine. But just after midnight, I heard it again. The tapping. It was louder this time, more insistent. My heart began to pound, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't just ignore it. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the front door. I stepped outside, the cold night air making me shiver. I walked over to Mr. Thompson's house, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house looked even more eerie at night, with its drawn curtains and peeling paint. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open. "Mr. Thompson?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty house. There was no response. The house was dark, and the air felt heavy. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The living room was empty, the furniture covered in dust. It didn't look like anyone had been living there for a long time. I moved further into the house, my heart pounding. I reached the hallway and saw a door at the end, slightly open. A faint light was coming from inside, flickering like a candle. I walked towards it, my hands trembling. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made me freeze. The room was filled with strange symbols, drawn all over the walls in what looked like red paint. Candles were scattered around, their flames flickering, casting eerie shadows. In the center of the room was a large mirror, and in front of it stood Mr. Thompson. He was staring at his reflection, his eyes wide and unblinking. His lips were moving, whispering something I couldn't understand. I felt a chill run through me. "Mr. Thompson?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't react. He just kept staring at the mirror, his whispering growing louder. Suddenly, he turned to look at me, his eyes filled with fear. "It's too late," he said, his voice trembling. "They're here." Before I could react, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. I heard something moving towards me, and I turned and ran. I stumbled through the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears, until I finally reached the front door. I burst outside, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was back in my house, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I had no idea what I had just seen, but I knew one thing: I wasn't staying here any longer. The next day, I packed my things and left. As I drove away, I saw the old woman across the street, watching me. She waved, but I couldn't bring myself to wave back. I knew I'd never forget what I had seen in that house, or the feeling that something was still watching me, even as I left that quiet street behind.